cover a few housekeeping items before we turn to our program. We're providing ASL interpretation and closed captioning today. You can go to the bottom of your screen and click on Interpretation to select whether you would like to view the ASL interpretation. And you can turn on closed captioning at the bottom right of the screen by clicking on the Show Captions button itself, or by clicking on the arrow next to Show Captions and selecting View Full Transcript. You can send in questions today by using the Q&A feature or by emailing them to questions@cdt.org. You can also submit them via Twitter to @SendDemTech or by using the hashtag CDTQuestions. To kick us off, I'll turn it over to our President and CEO of CDT, Alexandra Reeve-Gibbons.
Great, thank you so much, Reddy, and hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. For an increasing number of people across the United States and other countries, decisions about whether they are hired, promoted, or fired are now influenced by employment decision tools, software whose use or inner workings are largely hidden from workers. These tools can include resume scanning tools, which look for keywords in an applicant's resume, online games, which purport to assess traits like an applicant's appetite for risk, or personality quizzes, which can ask questions like, do you agree with this statement? I often feel sad. Often, these tools work by evaluating how applicants compare to existing employees in the hiring company. That's a dangerous approach. It can entrench existing inequalities in the workplace or assess workers based on factors that have little or nothing to do with the ability to perform the essential functions of a job. CDT and other civil rights, workers' rights, and tech policy groups have been sounding the alarm about the dangers of these tools. Yet algorithmic discrimination in employment still faces little to no accountability, in large part due to the lack of transparency to workers and regulators regarding where the tools are used and exactly how they work. We're glad that regulators are starting to take notice. Last year, the Biden administration released the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which describes some of the risks of algorithmic decision-making tools and called for action. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Department of Labor have an initiative on the use of AI in employment decisions. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is running a process on identifying and mitigating the risks of AI. And NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration within the Department of Commerce, has launched an inquiry into discriminatory uses of data. In addition to all of that work happening in the executive branch in the US, legislators at the federal, state, and local level are also focusing on this issue, as well as the broader discussion around algorithmic accountability. And then in Europe, regulators are closely examining these issues as part of the European AI Act and other initiatives as well. Both despite and because of all this regulatory activity, there's an urgent need to move from high-level principles and warnings to concrete guidance for policymakers to draw on, for companies that make these tools, for employers deciding whether and how to use them, and for workers who deserve to know their rights. For that reason, CDT is proud to have partnered with coalitions to release the Civil Rights Standards for 21st Century Employment Selection Procedures, which is the subject of today's webinar. The partners who participated in drafting the standards are an exceptional group, and they show the cross-cutting importance of this issue. The ACLU, the American Association of People with Disabilities, Upturn, the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, and the National Women's Law Center. We were also proud to receive endorsements from the Badalahi Center for Mental Health Law, Color of Change, the National Employment Law Project, and other organizations as well. The goal of these civil rights standards is to set out recommendations for how to scrutinize and mitigate risks of discrimination in employment decision tools. They build on years of advocacy by our organizations and others for regulators to use their rulemaking, investigative, and enforcement authorities to address technology's role in hiring. We hope they'll inform some of the legislative and regulatory efforts underway, but even apart from that, and critically for this audience, we hope this gives concrete guidance to employers now about how to act responsibly in this space and do right by their workers. We're really glad to be joined today by some of our collaborators on the standards for a discussion about what they recommend and their role in the current employment landscape. So I'll say a final thank you to all of you and pass it over to Matt Shearer, CDT's Senior Policy Counsel for Workers' Rights and Technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Hello, I'm Matt Shearer, and I lead CDT's Workers' Rights Project. which focuses on the ways in which technology can both imperil and empower workers in the modern workplace and labor market. A key part of this project is advocating for stronger oversight and enforcement against modern tools that can undermine workers' access to employment. This led us to partner with our sister organizations to create the civil rights standards. I'd like to introduce my fellow speakers and invite them to share a little about their work on tech-driven employment barriers. First, we have Henry Claypool, technology policy consultant for the American Association of People with Disabilities and a fellow at CDT. Henry?
Thanks, Matt. Hi, I'm Henry Claypool, a technology policy consultant with the American Association of People with Disabilities. AAPD is a leading national cross-disability rights advocacy organization working on a broad range of issues that affect our community. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a white male using a wheelchair, and I have brown and gray hair for a visual description. We're really pleased to contribute to developing these civil rights standards and deeply indebted to CDT for their leadership in developing these standards to protect workers across the civil rights community from discrimination that can occur when using employment-related automated decision-making tools. These standards take an intersectional approach to addressing discrimination across these protected classes. This is particularly important with disability because ableism is difficult for many people to identify and relate to. Taking this approach also benefits those grappling with their identity as a person, as a disabled person. The unemployment rate for disabled people is above 10% in 2021, while the unemployment rate in the general public was about 3.5%. That makes the unemployment rate for people with disabilities out 300% higher than the general public. This makes it all the more important that we develop strategies to remove bias in automated decision-making processes that can result in workplace discrimination. And the civil rights standards are an excellent example of the type of actions that policymakers can take to address employment-related disparities experienced by those of us living with disabilities, and of course, other groups. The good news in adopting the use of these civil rights standards is that it yields two-sided benefits to employers. They mitigate legal exposure to discrimination and enrich the applicant pool by making sure that all qualified people can be considered for employment. And I'll turn it back to Matt.
Thank you, Henry. Next, we have Olga Axelrod, Senior Staff Attorney for the ACLU's Racial Justice Program. Olga?
Thanks so much, Matt. The ACLU has dedicated itself to addressing issues of algorithmic bias and other harms of automated systems in a wide range of areas, from government uses such as the criminal legal system and family regulation, to uses in the context of life opportunities such as housing, employment, and credit, or HEC, which is where I focus my work. And because the use of automated tools in HEC pose an enormous danger to all historically marginalized communities, the Racial Justice Program works closely on these issues with members of ACLU's Disability Rights Program, its Women's Rights Program, and several others. In the area of employment, our work has taken a multi-pronged approach. First, we work in close coordination with other national civil rights and tech equity groups, including the panelists here, advocating for the EEOC, DOL, as well as other government agencies to really prioritize safeguarding against the real-life harms of automated systems. There's certainly a lot of work here for legislators to do to pass stronger protections against algorithmic discrimination across the board and for data privacy protections. But we also just need to see robust regulation and enforcement under existing civil rights laws. As Alex mentioned, we are beginning to see some movement there with the White House's blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights and the EEOC and DOJ's guidance on the application of the ADA to automated technologies. But those are just first steps towards the kinds of agency action that is necessary. For example, we now need to see the EEOC and other agencies that are tasked with enforcing civil rights employment laws to really build on that groundwork, including by developing similar guidance on the application of Title VII and the ADA to these technologies, and really setting out much more detailed standards for employers on what processes these tools need to undergo if they're going to use them. We really appreciate CDT's leadership on the civil rights standards we're discussing today. They provide agencies and users of these tools with the benefit of our collective thinking on the weeds of what those processes need to be, what specific protections are needed for workers when employers use automated or deterministic selection tools, and what tools pose just too great of a risk for discrimination to be employed. And the second part of that multi-pronged approach that the ACLU is taking is litigation to hold industry players accountable and as a means to push for industry to conform its practices to comply with existing civil rights laws. So, for example, the ACLU is one of the many organizations that took on Facebook's discriminatory targeting tools for employment ads and filed a complaint to the EEOC about those practices in 2018. We are also currently investigating certain applicant screening and assessment tools, but that's all I can say on that investigation for now.
Thank you very much, Olga. Next is Mitra Badalahi, Senior Project Director for Economic Justice at Upturn. Go ahead, Mitra.
Thanks, Matt. I'm so pleased to join you all today to discuss the launch of the Civil Rights Standards and the ways in which automated employment decisions impact workers and may perpetuate significant injustices. I work with Upturn, a nonprofit that works to advance justice and equity wherever technology is used. We do research and advocacy to shape technology's role in key civil rights areas, such as housing, employment, policing, and the courts. Over the past 5 years, Upturn has produced 2 major reports analyzing how automated employment decisions affect labor and employment in the United States. The first report, Help Wanted, was published in 2018 and details how various predictive tools are used throughout the hiring process. The report underscores that hiring is rarely a single decision point, but is rather a cumulative series of small decisions. And when these decisions are made as a result of predictive hiring tools that reflect institutional and systemic biases, certain job applicants will experience discrimination. The second report, Essential Work, was published in 2021. In it, we analyzed how hiring technologies were used by large hourly employers to filter job applicants. Methodologically, we did this by submitting online applications to 15 large hourly employers in the Washington, D.C. metro area and scrutinizing each process. We observed a blend of algorithmic hiring systems and traditional selection procedures, often brought together with applicant tracking systems. Our research confirmed that vast information asymmetries exist. It is almost impossible to fully assess employers' digital hiring practices from the outside. And the current US legal framework is woefully insufficient to protect job applicants. Regulators must be more proactive in their research and investigations, and agencies and legislatures must update existing rules and guidelines and create new laws to address the realities of modern hiring. The civil rights standards are important because they articulate specific, deep recommendations across a range of issues so as to course correct the current jobs and hiring landscape. I'm looking forward to the balance of our discussion on these standards today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitra. Lastly, we have my colleague, Riddhi Shetty, Policy Counsel on CDT's Privacy and Data Team. Riddhi?
Thanks, Matt. For over 4 decades, employers and vendors have been relying heavily on the 1978 Uniform Guidelines for Employee Selection Procedures to inform how they try to avoid disparate impact claims. But the guidelines do not exhaustively cover how to avoid disparate impact for all forms of discrimination, nor have they been updated to keep up with our understanding today of inequity in the job market and how bias manifests in modern tech-driven hiring practices. This is reflected in the issues we've observed, especially impacting disabled workers. CDT has analyzed how algorithm-driven hiring tools can potentially violate the Americans with Disabilities Act because of how tools are designed to be used and what criteria they measure, which can, in effect, screen out workers based on disability rather than on potential work performance. This is why we're glad that the EEOC and Justice Department issued new technical guidance last year to guide employers to ensure that the algorithm-driven tools they use in hiring are designed and developed to prevent disability discrimination. The technical assistance conveys that employers are responsible for the impacts of the hiring tools they use, whether developed in-house or by a vendor, that employers must address risks of discrimination in these tools more proactively, and that employers must also ensure that these tools are narrowly designed to only measure ability to perform essential job functions. There is much more to be done to address technology's impacts on workers based on race, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, and religion, and to address impacts for the intersection of disability with other marginalized identities. Still, while there have been some promising state and local level proposals for enforcement against algorithmic discrimination, we have seen other problematic proposals that would actually disincentivize employers and vendors from correcting algorithmic bias. This demonstrates the need for guidance about the kind of notice and auditing requirements that would achieve true algorithmic accountability. So to this end, CDT, the ACLU, AAPD, Upturn, the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, and the National Women Law Center work together to create the Civil Rights Standards for 21st Century Employment Selection Procedures, a set of standards to lay out what notice workers would receive about the use of modern selection tools, what auditing measures and considerations would mitigate discrimination in these tools, and how to hold vendors and employers accountable for using discriminatory tools. So we will now spend a few minutes discussing the substance of the standards and how they address the civil rights risks that modern selection tools can pose.
The civil rights standards build on the 5 civil rights principles for hiring assessment technologies that civil society organizations developed in 2020, stating specifically that the use of hiring technologies should ensure 5 things: non-discrimination, notice and explanation, job relatedness, auditing, and oversight and accountability. The civil rights standards promote non-discrimination by requiring employers and vendors to take proactive steps to minimize potential causes of discriminatory outcomes in their selection tools, to use the least discriminatory tools available, and to explore accommodations and more accessible alternative selection methods. The standards recommend against the use of more arbitrary selection tools like facial or voice analysis or personality assessment, which pose a greater risk of discriminatory outcomes.
The standards require notice and explanation through 3 tiers of notice tailored to the needs of different audiences. So first, employers and vendors should proactively provide short-form disclosure to workers that offers enough detail to help workers discern how the selection method in question would assess them and whether to exercise their right to request accommodations. Second, we recommend a more technical audit summary that provides regulators with enough detail to support oversight and enforcement efforts. And third, our proposed record-keeping obligations would have employers retain all relevant information about the selection methods they use to support future investigation and enforcement.
For the third principle, the standards call for job relatedness by requiring that selection tools be restricted to measuring a worker's ability to perform essential functions of the job position for which that worker has applied. Here, The standards push employers and vendors to think beyond the uniform guidelines for employee selection procedures to make sure selection methods are actually designed and developed to reliably assess whether workers can perform the job, rather than judging them on irrelevant, generic, or subjective traits. The standards require employers to explain why their tool should logically be expected to predict job performance, rather than relying exclusively on the existence of correlations between the result of a selection tool and often flawed measures of job performance.
As for the principle of auditing, these standards articulate detailed auditing requirements that would more effectively examine biases in employers' selection methods and results. Pre-deployment audits performed prior to deploying a selection tool would evaluate how well the tool measures actual ability to perform essential functions, identify risks of discrimination, and analyze whether any accommodations or alternative methods should be made available. The standards also recommend ongoing audits, at least annually, to re-examine these factors based on how the tool has impacted real workers, as well as any changes that have been made to the tool since the previous audit.
Finally, the standards call for more forceful oversight and accountability by explicitly recognizing that selection tools, whether automated or not, are unlawful if they cause discrimination. The standards would require employers and vendors alike to take responsibility for preventing tech-driven discrimination. They call for truly independent auditors who are accountable for their audit results. Further, the standards recommend that employers support an interactive dialogue with candidates, enabling workers to convey concerns about how a selection method will affect them, so that employers can provide accommodations or alternative selection methods in the immediate term and examine how to alleviate those concerns for future candidates. So, with that overview of the civil rights standards, we'll now turn to Olga, Mitra, and Henry for a panel discussion. So, in a moment, I'll be asking about the civil rights standards themselves. But for my first question to the panelists, I'd like to know, what do you see as the biggest risks to workers' civil rights that modern selection tools pose, particularly risks that policymakers haven't adequately addressed?
Well, Matt, maybe I can just put a couple out there to get started. Too many employers have too little knowledge of these tools, how they work, and the steps they need to take to mitigate risks of discrimination when using them. Employers often using these tools without scrutinizing the tools, using contemporary standards. These tools are developed by vendors that promise administrative efficiencies before employers integrate them into their HR practices. The data used to build these tools reflects current workplace inequities, which employers' diversity, equity, and inclusion practices are designed to combat, making it difficult to understand why employers aren't more attentive to this problem, since they undercut the investments they are making in diversifying their workforce. And a third that I would throw out before we hear from other panelists are the tools often measure characteristics of job seekers' performance that are not related to the job. They're looking at personality traits of what they believe would make a good employee, and they're often unsupported by the social science evidence that would support their use. And maybe we can hear from some of our other panelists, and I can always jump back in with a few more.
Thanks, Henry. It's important to understand that these tools are being used at every stage of the employment process, from recruiting and hiring to employee monitoring and surveillance, and they're widespread. So I will just take us through what some of these tools are. In the recruiting stage, online advertising has become one of the main ways that employers advertise their jobs. And automated tools play a pivotal role in determining who will and will not learn of a job opportunity. Platforms like Facebook have provided tools for employers to select target audiences based on protected characteristics, or, for example, have allowed employers to upload a list of current employees that a lookalike tool will use to find similar people to target the ad. And that really builds the results of historically biased hiring decisions into the selection of who gets to see new opportunities. And even where employers take steps to reach a broad audience, research has shown again and again that discriminatory assumptions have been built into ad algorithms themselves that similarly exclude based on protected characteristics. So the algorithm, for example, chooses to show ads for sales associates for cars primarily to men, sales associates for jewelry to women. Very similar concerns apply to recruitment platforms such as LinkedIn and ZipRecruiter, where an algorithm makes recommendations of job openings to job seekers and recommends job seekers to employers. Discrimination can be built there based on which job seekers are deemed similar to people who've been hired in the past, which jobs are similar to ones viewed by similar job seekers, etc. There is also widespread use of automated or deterministic decision tools at the application stage, many of which are now built into the applicant tracking systems that Mitra mentioned. And I will just briefly note, one concern is that these systems make it far easier to build in background checks based on criminal records, civil records, and others, which can disproportionately harm people of color due to disparities in policing and access to mainstream financial institutions. But focusing on the automation or deterministic selection tools in particular, employers are using automated resume screening tools and even chatbots to filter out or rank out applicants based on knockout questions, keyword requirements, or specific qualifications or characteristics. And that can create really rigid rules that can weed out qualified candidates that a human reviewer may have otherwise interviewed, or screen out, for example, as many of them do, for gaps in work history of more than 6 months, which creates barriers for people who've been pregnant or have disabilities. Employers also use various automated or deterministic assessment tools to conduct personality testing. And we've talked already about how those assess these very amorphous personality traits like enthusiasm or work style. They are using online versions of multiple choice personality tests and even gamified assessments that are video game type tools that claim to assess traits through an automated analysis of how someone plays a video game. Employers are also using online video interviewing tools that are designed to similarly measure these kinds of amorphous traits. And they're sometimes using voice analysis that assesses both content and such things as tone, pitch, word choice, and video analysis that assesses visual factors such as facial expressions, eye contact, postures. There are numerous concerns with these screening and assessment tools. These tools, as you've heard, often use historical data on an employer's existing workforce and rely on really subjective assessments by employers as to which employees have been successful to train the algorithm as its ground truth. So again, that recreates historically discriminatory hiring processes and can really reflect institutional and systemic biases in the workplace. These systems also normally function by analyzing a large amount of data to uncover correlations and make predictions, but the correlations that are uncovered may have no causal connection with being a successful employee, may not even be job related, and can be proxies for protected characteristics. So for example, there was a resume screening company that found that there was a correlation between job tenure and residing within a certain distance of the office, which is a proxy for race due to redlining and other practices that have led to housing segregation. With respect to assessments, you've heard already that we have grave concerns that they are measuring for amorphous personality traits that are not clearly job-related or necessary, and then may reflect standards and norms that are culturally specific or screen out candidates with disabilities. And the gamified assessments and video and audio interview analysis just adds another layer of concern there. Measuring physical interaction with a computer raises a host of disability concerns. Vocal analysis may perform poorly on people with accents or with speech disabilities, and relies on language processing tools that have been shown to be discriminatory against people of color. And current video technology performs more poorly at recognizing the faces of women with darker skin. A lot of my work has been in hiring, but I just want to also note that you do see a lot of automation now in worker evaluation and surveillance, especially in low-wage jobs. And that is being used by employers for key decisions, such as setting hours, promotion, discipline, termination. Many of these tools raise similar concerns to the tools used for hiring, including discrimination based on disabilities and other protected characteristics, but they also raise additional concerns such as creating barriers to workers organizing, increased encroachments on worker privacy, and setting unreasonable and dangerous pace and productivity expectations. And yet, add to all this that there's a huge information gap for applicants and workers. So there's a huge risk of discrimination for workers here.
And Matt, maybe I can jump back in and just share some kind of anecdotal. My experience with numerous people in the disability community, they report interacting with these online, what they describe are screening tools. They're unsure of what's going on exactly, why they're being asked the questions they are, and often express frustration with the fact that they don't get a job interview or they don't move any further along, become frustrated and stop their job search right there. And I think this is real evidence that workers don't know when they're interacting with these tools, and this leaves them without insight into how employers might use their responses in the hiring process. The lack of notice and information on the interaction with these automated systems makes it impossible for a disabled person to know if they need and request a reasonable accommodation during that process. Without providing notice and explanation to an automated system, it's difficult for the employer to create a process to extend a reasonable accommodation to an employee in this process. So it just real evidence there that the risks are pretty high and steps need to be taken. Another area is when these tools are used on employees. And I'm here just sharing a little bit about worker productivity. When measures are used based on kind of normative expectations about how one should perform their job, sometimes they aren't related to the essential functions. And those norms and standards can put them at risk for workplace injuries. And that's a real concern, not only for disabled workers, but for people that might in fact incur a disability that's job related due to some types of circumstances that they encounter in the workplace. And finally, I'd add just the consideration about accessibility. Really, these tools are often inaccessible. That might mean that they aren't compatible with people that use assistive devices, such as a screen reader that a blind person might use, or somebody that doesn't read from the screen, but actually listens to it, will use a screen reader to get the information they need. Or someone with an augmentative communication device. In other words, they aren't generating speech in a traditional way. They're using a tool to generate that speech, and that the data input isn't well received by these tools. obviously it would run into time limits and things like that for somebody that's using one of these augmentative communication devices trying to put their data input in. So there are other examples of inaccessibility, but I'll stop there and maybe turn it over to Mitra for her turn.
Yeah, I think the only things I would add are maybe obvious, but I think many people's notions of how jobs and hiring play out in the world are outdated at this point. I think the information asymmetry that we've alluded to, the difficulties in identifying exactly what's happening in these processes have also contributed, I think, to a public misunderstanding of what the process of trying to obtain work it is actually like in our modern technological era. And I think that that's a real challenge that needs to be overcome. We hear all the time from people who are trying to get a job, and the processes that they are subjected to are so onerous, they're so overwhelming, they're so opaque that often people will quit midstream in an application, or they'll muscle through and finish the application only to never hear back, not advance, not have any sense of what happened. And I think over time that really ossifies a power imbalance that we should be concerned about from a civil rights perspective in this country. So that's all I'll add to those very helpful comments from my colleagues. And the Help Wanted report that I mentioned, which Jamal has now sent around in the chat, lists out the funnel of hiring and shows you at every step where some of these technologies intercede and limit applicants' access to jobs.
And I'll just quickly add before asking the next question, I definitely would recommend giving the reports that Mitra mentioned a read. There is very little transparency a lot of the time into the way that these tools operate. And so the kind of investigative and research work that those reports represent are really some of the most valuable insights that we have into the ways in which these tools are being used and affecting workers on a day-to-day basis. So, first off, before I go on, do our panelists have anything else that they want to toss in or mention? All right. So, as I indicated, the next thing I'd like to ask is about the civil rights standards. And you've talked about the many concerns regarding the risks associated with these tools. In what ways do you see the civil rights standards as a promising approach to helping address those?
Shall I open up again, Matt? I'll just
go right ahead, Henry.
A couple points here, and they really expand a bit on the points made about the barriers here and the challenges that we face. Raising awareness of employers, raise awareness of employers that there is a need to use contemporary measures to address the risks associated with using these tools, because unchecked, they can create and perpetuate discrimination against applicants. Employers and vendors now have a very specific set of steps that they can take to ensure that these tools are aligned with their efforts to mitigate bias and to limit legal exposure during the hiring process. And of course, they would enjoy the benefits associated with enhancing the diversity of their workforce if they look to and follow the civil rights standards. So of course we want to push those out. I would just quickly note that notice and explanation requirements would help job applicants understand when and how the tools are used in the hiring process. This step would help employers and potential employees understand how the predictive tools allow for employers to open channels for reasonable accommodation and allowing an applicant to opt out perhaps for some legitimate reason. Again, it would enhance the job relatedness, the focus on essential functions that the civil rights standards brings, gives employers and developers the ability to focus on specific knowledge, skills, and ability that are needed to perform a specific job. The auditing requirements help employers and vendors work on mitigating bias and tools used in the hiring process. And the pre-deployment audit that's called for make sure that employers and vendors are doing this work before they use it. I would also note that the standards address privacy concerns by preventing employers and vendors from extracting biometric data from candidates and releasing this sensitive data without their consent. And I think lastly, I'd note that the standards require employees to consider the accessibility of these systems and to ensure that the technology works for people with disabilities. And that will be an ongoing discussion, since we know that even basic access to the information that's online remains inaccessible to people with disabilities, particularly those that use screen readers, like I mentioned before, because there aren't regulatory requirements for online information that is really necessary in today's world for people to navigate the environment, to seek jobs, apply for, and even order pizzas. So with that, I can turn it back to Matt, or I guess my other panelists, and maybe they'll want to jump in.
Yeah, really +1 to everything Henry said about the strengths of these standards and how they're beneficial for employers. I want to add that there's also a major benefit of these standards to regulators, because we cannot rely on individual employers to find and evaluate the standards themselves. And we really need regulators to step into the void and provide detailed guidance to employers for best practices so they can understand what specific evaluation processes their tools need to undergo, what they need to provide to applicants and workers, and have clear standards for when mitigation or decommission measures should be employed. And that is not an easy task for all regulators, a lot of whom have not yet developed the technical expertise on these issues. So the civil rights standards give regulators a really strong jumping off point from civil rights groups that have assessed these issues in depth. And I think adoption of the notice and evaluation and transparency measures in the civil rights standards in particular is also just necessary for regulators to be able to perform their enforcement function. We've talked about how the adoption of these kinds of tools has really greatly widened the information gap between job seekers and workers on the one hand and employers on the other. A lot of these technologies are just invisible to workers, or workers are aware that a technology is being used, but not how or the manner in which it's impacting them. And this has made it more challenging for individuals and the private bar to file complaints with agencies or in court, and more difficult for regulatory agencies to address the harms as a result. So these measures in the civil rights standards would allow individuals to have more information about how the tools are being used in order to pursue their rights. And that in turn would give regulators the information they need to identify and address discrimination under existing laws.
And I would just add, from the perspective of job seekers, again, just a matter of basic fairness. I think we can all relate to the idea that people should understand the processes that they're being subjected to, and those processes should be fair and applied evenly. And I think very importantly, should have some relationship to the task at hand. So subjecting applicants to these very invasive personality tests and other assessments that have little or no bearing on the purpose of the process, which is to seek and obtain employment, is really problematic. And I think the standards, again, they try to emphasize these ideas, these underlying principles that if incorporated fully into our system of employment and employment seeking in this country, would really level up the playing field and give people more of an opportunity to have fair experiences, and also to not be subject to extraneous invasive questions or processes that have no bearing on their ability to do the job for which they are applying. So I think that there's a lot of gap filling that the standards do to try to give job applicants a fairer and more transparent experience in seeking employment.
Great, thank you. Any follow-ups or thoughts? All right. Well, I now want to kind of look ahead to what we can do going forward and what different stakeholders in this process can do. So first off, what are some steps that you think workers and civil rights advocates who are engaged about these issues or who are interested in these issues, what can they do going forward to raise awareness of the risks associated with these tools and help drive potential solutions?
Matt, I can open again. We can always start with employers, engage employers directly on the use of these tools and work with their human resources associations to ensure that they understand how these tools can be improved and the pressing need to take action to avoid discrimination. Of course, we need to engage people seeking employment and especially those that are at risk of discrimination from these tools, compile information on the harms that they experience and share that information with policymakers so that they can understand the urgent need to address these issues. We can work with news outlets and other media to tell clear stories about when people encounter these tools and the negative consequences that occur when they do. Of course, we can tell the story of how people struggle to identify when they're even interacting with these hiring tools and what types of recourse they might have when they encounter them, to really round out an understanding in the minds of policymakers and others that there is a real problem here and that more information is needed. If this action isn't taken by employers, of course, we need policymakers to intervene. And I would, again, emphasize mobilizing consumer voices to make sure that these policymakers understand that there is a need for action, that concerns and that there are real concerns here, and encourage policymakers to take this into consideration when they're prioritizing all the competing interests that they deal with in this space around the workplace and the labor context. And leave it for some other ideas. I've got a few more that I can add after the others go.
I'll just add here that I think we as civil rights advocates need to recognize, I think we do recognize, but we need to proceed with the understanding of how difficult it can be for advocates to gain a foothold on these issues. Since starting this work, one of the things that has been really notable for me is that several large traditional civil rights organizations, such as the ones that have partnered on these standards, are very engaged in these issues, including the ACLU. We've understood that these technological tools are the new frontier of discrimination, and these orgs have put the resources in over the years into getting into the weeds on the technology and building close partnerships with technology focused groups to be able to advocate effectively on this. But for many civil rights advocates, there's a real barrier to entry on these issues, because even when they know that the tools pose a threat, a lot of advocates will be hesitant to tackle them because of a lack of the technological expertise and a lack of resources in building up that expertise. So it's really critical that there be a lot of cross-pollination here, and that the groups that have the technological expertise really provide support for the civil rights advocates that don't have those resources. And that collaboration is already happening, but it's just critical that organizations like ours that have been able to develop expertise here really make these issues more accessible to a broader range of advocates.
And I would add, I think that there are a lot of persistent divides, for instance, between people seeking jobs and people who are already employed. And so I think civil rights advocates can do more to build movement power with labor unions, workers' rights organizations, and try to bridge what I think is an artificial divide, because if job applicants are being weeded out using these inappropriate personality tests because they seem to be prone to organizing activity, that has an impact on the workplace as a whole. And so current employees should care about that and should be able to work with job applicants to try to safeguard against those kinds of forms of elimination of job applicants, for example. And so I think power building across movements is really important. And, to Olga's point, technical assistance and expertise is really essential, because it's very hard to understand what these tools are and how they actually function in the world. And I think going back to the civil rights standards, the requirement of having some more transparency and giving people more access to information is really important as well. And it's a sort of a chicken and egg problem. If you have that information, it's easier to organize and create a movement. Without that information, it's harder to do it. And yet more important in some ways, because we need to build power in order to confront these trends.
Right. I think so much of this goes back to transparency and being able to get greater insights into how these tools operate. And I think that that's one of the main reasons that I've heard from advocates more generally as to why they got engaged on these issues. It's a unique thing that kind of requires a level of expertise and understanding that hasn't been necessary with lots of tools that have been used to assess employees in the past. Henry, I believe you said you had some more thoughts on this.
Sure. I mean, building on the points that we're making here, I just wanted to give you a really tangible example of what it's like working in kind of the disability rights space. There are a number of groups that are working on technology, but their work there is often focused on aspects of accessibility or the use of assistive technology. This concept of thinking about it in policy terms and really understanding the breadth of technology's role in today's society is difficult to appreciate, because these organizations are working on, fighting the battles that people with disabilities face and in other areas of society. And along comes technology, presents a learning curve for these organizations to really come up to speed or hire the expertise to begin doing the work that's really needed to generate the type of change that we're looking for. And so AAPD is very fortunate to be able to kind of establish this platform and build on it, where we're able to bring some of that, at least awareness raising and our limited expertise on these issues to share with our peer organizations in the disability rights and disability justice space, and hope that in some ways that we can work together to really raise a level of awareness, but also organize and become more active in pursuing change around some of the barriers that our community is encountering. Again, that, back to the transparency aspect, that's really difficult when technology is so integrated that it's not really that apparent to people when they're interacting with it. We've used this example a number of times in this discussion today. And so when people don't know they have a problem, they don't report that to their national organization. And that type of information then isn't shared with the disability rights groups when they're doing their work. So we do have a fair amount of work to do. And that really calls for us to build these broad-based coalitions like we're doing now on this very issue, to make sure that we are not only bringing these voices to the fore, but we're sharing them with the right stakeholders to generate the type of change that we really need to see.
All right, Mitra, Olga, any thoughts before we turn to the next question, which is closely related? So actually, I'll just hop right in and you can add your thoughts, Olga and Mitra. I'll ping it over to you two for responses to this. So kind of a similar question. The last one I focused on, what is it that advocates can do? I'd like to talk about what employers can do. What are some steps that employers could take? What are the things that you think employers should keep an eye on, and those who engage with employers, when it comes to making sure that these tools are non-discriminatory and are assessing candidates fairly?
Olga, maybe I'll start with just a quick comment about, again, job relatedness, and then I'll kick it over to you to talk more about discrimination and existing civil rights laws. So I think that what we are seeing happening in this field is a little bit of a snowball effect. So there's it's not clear to me that employers, especially large employers, are necessarily affirmatively considering what the contours of these processes are and how they are going to impact the workforce. And I think that's because there's little to no oversight or regulation. And so they can just sort of contract out with these third-party vendors, implement their tools, and run with it. And the result of that can be, as we've talked about, the application of really irrelevant tests or questions or other hoops that applicants have to jump through. And I think that it is incumbent on employers to ensure that the processes that they subject applicants to are actually related to the job for which the person is applying. And there should be real limits on employers' ability to ask invasive questions about someone's personality or emotions or, abstract problem-solving skills that have nothing to do with the actual job. And I think so part of it is just taking responsibility and drawing a line and saying, if we are going to ask someone to complete some kind of assessment, that assessment has to be clearly related to the job in question. So, if someone is applying to be a cashier and you want to ask them questions to see if they're able to do simple calculations and make change quickly, fine. But why are you asking them if they consider themselves a generally happy person or generally content person? That's completely irrelevant and inappropriate. So I think to really, again, emphasize and underscore one of the key principles, job relatedness is really important, and employers should do more to ensure that any step that they require of an applicant is actually related to the job for which the person is applying.
Yeah, +1 to all of that. And I think that the structure of the standards really lays out what we think employers should be doing, which is, first off, there are just certain kinds of tools that have too high of a risk of discrimination. And that is the kind of tools Mitra just talked about with regards to personality assessments. It's also the kind of tools that are really relying on how someone physically interacts with a computer, any kind of video, facial analysis or vocal analysis. There's just too great of a risk there, in addition to whether those tests actually even pass the smell test. But there's too great of a risk there that proxies for protected characteristics is what those tests are actually measuring, as opposed to things that are job related. And then for tools that don't have such a high risk of discrimination as those, right? Those are particularly high risk discrimination. But for other kinds of tools, I think the standards really lay out what employers need to be doing, which is pre-deployment and post-deployment auditing, sort of throughout the life cycle. Notice to people that these tools are being used on, that really provides them with enough information to know whether they need an accommodation or not, and that can really give people information about how to get an accommodation. And opt-out measures as well. People should not have to undergo these kinds of automated processes without, alternative paths to employment. So I think the standards really lay out what we need of employers, and this also needs to be not just what employers sort of do when they're developing their own tools, but also what kind of information are they demanding of vendors before they actually deploy one of these tools. I think right now employers are relying on vendors blindly to sort of allow vendors to say whatever they're going to say about what tests that they have conducted on these things. A lot of vendors are making unsubstantiated claims about how these tools are not discriminatory. Employers need to hold vendors to task here and need to demand that kind of auditing and proof to ensure that these tools are not discriminatory.
Great. Before I ask if there's any kind of closing thoughts on this, I'll mention for the people who are listening via live stream, we're about to move into an audience Q&A segment. If you have any questions, you can tweet them to us at Twitter at CindemTech and use, that's CindemTech, Center for Democracy and Technology, and use hashtag CDT questions. You can also email them to us via questions@cdt.org. So before we turn to audience questions, any closing thoughts from our panelists on the issue of how we can engage employers when it comes to these tools? All right. Well, I will start off, and Riddy from CDT is going to join the panelists as one of the people who will respond to these questions. The first thing that I would like to ask, can you talk about disparate impact with respect to other protected classes such as religion or sexual orientation? And are there data concerns with any particular protected characteristics?
Well, I can jump in with some initial thoughts on this while folks think further. The first couple of examples that come to mind in particular are targeted job advertising or platforms that target job postings, as well as resume screening. So on the former, you can have, for instance, social media platforms that use users' online activity to kind of build an audience to whom the ads will be targeted. So that can include information about their interests, including like activities with religious organizations or with any kind of affinity groups that would indicate either religion or sexual orientation. Same thing can happen with platforms that target job postings where some of that information could be included on somebody's profile. So if they had volunteer experience or participation in student organizations or even past work experience, that could be indicated on their profile, and that can help inform whether certain postings are directed to them. And a similar function can then also happen with resume screening tools too, where if you have that kind of information in a resume that you're submitting as part of your application, those kinds of terms could end up weighing against you in the way that your resume is kind of scanned through compared to other applicants as well.
Yeah, and I think with respect to gender and sexual identity, I think, you know, the kinds of concerns we have about what are the norms that are built into the interviewing tools, to some extent the personality tools, all of those apply as well really to all of the protected characteristics, because they are built on certain standards for what is the proper way to act, what is the proper way to react to situations, and with the video and vocal analysis, how people speak, how people appear. So all of those same kinds of concerns that we have talked about with respect to those tools are going to apply to gender and sexual identity and other protected characteristics as well.
All right, thank you. So next question. What kinds of research would support organizing, advocacy, and policy in this area? And are there any particular gaps? And Mitra and Olga, I know that both of your organizations either have done or are looking at different sorts of research and investigations on these issues. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of what additional, particularly research, could be done in this space.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are a lot of different possible areas that are really sort of ripe for investigation. One is to sort of echo something I said earlier, looking more closely at how, what are the sort of downstream consequences of some of the assessments that are used at the job applicant stage. What happens to a workforce when people are filtered out based on personality tests and other assessments that aren't directly related to the job in question, but may limit the staff who are brought on to people who are less likely to, for example, organize or raise grievances with the employer. Again, part of what that would help achieve is a better, fuller understanding of the real world, concrete, holistic consequences of the way that jobs are currently being, filtered through these technological systems and these various processes. That's one. I think another one is understanding more sort of the political economy of these vendors, these products, how do they come to be developed? Why do employers, how do employers come to adopt them? What kinds of incentives exist, structural incentives to use these kinds of products, these automated tools, rather than to not use these automated tools. I think there's a lot of really interesting open questions there. And I think that also is important in understanding why there feels like there's a lot of momentum behind these various tools, and that they're proliferating and being used with greater and greater frequency. And they don't always facilitate or streamline the process. Sometimes they add layers and they can be expensive and onerous. So why is it that they are being implemented into the hiring process? Who is benefiting from those decisions, and how are those decisions being made? Are there structural incentives that need to be understood for advocates and others who are concerned about these tools and might want to confront or interrupt their use. So those are a couple of fields that I think would be really interesting and where research would be very valuable.
Yeah, totally agree with everything that Mitra said. And I guess one of the things that I would add is that research in this area is really difficult. We know that quite a few researchers work in this field and have tried to do things like sort of catalog which employers are using certain tools and in what stages of processes. And because of that lack of transparency, it's also a huge barrier for researchers as well to uncover that information. Just to give you an example, the ACLU about a year ago tried to sort of do a cataloging of what are all of the employers out there that are using specifically video and audio analysis of interviews. And what we found is that it's not very hard to identify the vendors that are selling those products. Some of those vendors also will list some employer clients that they have as a means of advertising their tool. But the vendors sell a number of tools, right? And they have different kinds of elements to them. A lot of video interviewing vendors, for example, will sell a tool where all that they're doing is recording the interview that is being conducted by sort of a standardized computer. And then a human at the employer will watch it later. And so you still have human review and human analysis and assessment of that interview. Other employers are using that tool plus the automated AI analysis so that a human being never has to look at that interview. But there's no way to tell that, right? There's no way to figure out, are they just using recording, pre-recording, or are they also using that automated analysis? Most of the time, that level of detail is not available online. And that level of detail is not given to applicants either. Applicants are aware when they are being interviewed online. They are not aware of how that interview is then assessed. So there's a lot of barriers to research here. One of the things that we've really pushed is for the EOC, for example, to use the full scope of their investigative power to do that kind of research, to really bring some light to these processes that are otherwise quite closed off to researchers.
All right. Any other thoughts on research before we turn to the next question? All right. So the next question that we've got deals with legislative action. Someone asked, if you could write a U.S. bill to aid on this issue, what would it be? To a certain degree, I think that the easy answer would be find a way to turn the civil rights standards into legislation. Not to put words into anybody's mouth. So I'll ask maybe about legislative priorities. I'll recast the question slightly. Let's say that, there's no way that we're going to get the civil rights standards in every single detail passed through Congress. I know this might be somewhat like choosing your favorite child, but what are the areas that you would prioritize first? What do you think are the first things that need to be addressed when it comes to mitigating the risks associated with modern selection tools?
Just speaking from a consumer perspective, I think it would be really nice to know when you're interacting with one. And so the notice requirements are quite helpful, obviously, in that regard. Getting some more detailed information about how they work is another layer deeper that I think is really important to provide to people so that they can really understand how their responses are going to relate back to their prospects for seeking employment with a particular company. I don't want to limit what we could get, but I think from a consumer perspective, that at least allows people to better understand, oh, that's what this is. And maybe there's a way for me to contact the employer and find out if I can get an accommodation in this process, or let them know that my technology doesn't interface well with the website that they put up for me to go to. That type of information would be particularly helpful to folks that are out there seeking a job, just trying to go about their day, but also earn a living. And I know there are other areas that maybe I'll let the others jump in, and also keep mine in reserve.
I mean, I think just to piggyback very immediately off of what you just said, Henry, I think that, I think good legislation is informed by a deep understanding of reality. And the information asymmetry that we keep talking about is a really essential impediment to not only wrapping our minds around the costs and consequences to the working people of America of the systems that exist, but also in thinking about how to rectify or make fair the way that people go about getting employment in this modern era. And so I think that the notice and the oversight and the auditing requirements, those are the kinds of pieces that I think would generate more information, more data points, a deeper understanding of how things are playing out. Because I'm sure that, it's not like these are monolithic tools. There's probably a very interesting and wide variation in how various tools play out in different contexts, and we don't understand that as clearly as we need to. And then that could inform additional or further legislative or regulatory action. So yeah, I agree with the instinct to prioritize those types of pieces.
Yeah, I totally agree with that as well. I think all of the measures in the civil rights standard pertaining to transparency, and that really includes the notice measures to applicants and the assessment measures, all of that is about really shining a light on what these practices are so that people can press their own rights, and so that civil rights enforcement can happen. And the only thing I'll add is just sort of, building off of what I said earlier, which is that legislation would be quite helpful in this area to just sort of clarify that these kinds of processes need to happen. But we fully believe that existing civil rights laws provide the authority to enforcement agencies to take these measures as well as a form of regulation, because enforcement with respect to these tools is not currently happening in the way that it needs to. And the reason that it's not currently happening is that all of this information gap that we've been talking about that really hurts applicants, that makes it harder for the private bar, also makes it harder for enforcement agencies to enforce the civil rights laws. So I think legislation would be really helpful here, but to the extent that we can't get legislation because of all of the gridlock, that is just the reality. I think that regulatory agencies have the authority that they need to put these measures into place as well.
Matt, one other issue that I'll raise, and I don't even know if it needs to be a prioritization issue. It's one that may be revealing of my naivete, but I'll go ahead and raise it again anyway. I've been wondering why corporations that dedicate resources to their DEI efforts, the disability equity and inclusion efforts, aren't really actively embracing these approaches to mitigating the bias that might be at play in these hiring tools. And again, it seems to undercut those efforts. And I would think that, I know that employers are out there looking to mitigate bias, but they're looking to standards like I think Riddy mentioned earlier, the uniform guidelines that are so outdated. They were created way before the ADA was even promulgated. So it just seems like there's ample resources inside of these large corporations for people to put the pieces of the puzzle together to figure out that looking at the civil rights standards is actually, and adopting and using them is in their self-interest and allows them to really benefit more richly from their efforts to expand the workforce through their DEI initiatives. So again, I'll put that out there and hope it goes in the right direction.
All right, thank you. Very briefly, I'm going to ask one more question before we wrap up. We've spent a lot of time talking today about hiring assessments in particular. I'd love to hear a couple of thoughts on during the employment life of a worker in and of itself, how assessment technologies are being used and the ways in which they raise concerns. So the use of them for promotion decisions, to set pay, termination, any thoughts or anecdotes or experiences that our panelists have had on those later in the employment life cycle stage decisions.
I mean, I'll jump in and actually plug CDT's work on Bossware. I think that there is a really disturbing proliferation of surveillance in employment, and that surveillance is used in myriad ways to harm workers. Again, there's a real lack of transparency in exactly how things play out, but you have basically management by algorithm. You have tools that are being used to subject workers to really damaging productivity expectations or other standards that are not only not sustainable for individual workers, but that really shift power in a damaging way away from workers. And so I think that we have focused today on selection and hiring because that's an important part of this puzzle, but it's not the only part. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about how there needs to be more solidarity between people who are applying for jobs and people who are trying to advocate on behalf of job applicants and those who already have jobs and people who advocate on behalf of existing workers, because a lot of the same consequences in terms of structural shifts in power are going to play out in the workforce once you have the job because of the tools, Bossware and other mass surveillance technologies that are increasingly deployed against workers. So I think that's one area that is really important to keep our eyes on and not lose sight of.
Yeah, and that's totally correct. And I think there is a lot of really good research out there on Bossware. In addition to the CDT report, there's been some great work by Data and Society and Coworker. I don't have those links handy, but I just found a list that I accessed really quick. So I'm just putting that into the chat so that folks can search for those reports. UC Berkeley Labor Center is here as well. So really great studies out there on some of the tools that are being used.
All right. Well, I want to thank our panelists for giving us a great discussion on these issues. And more broadly, just to wrap up, on behalf of CDT, the ACLU, the AAPD, Upturn, the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, and the National Women's Law Center, I want to thank our speakers and our participants for joining our discussion today on the civil rights standards for 21st century employment selection procedures. We'd also like to thank Aaron Reiki, Amalia Smirniotopoulos, Kai Feldblum, Clarence Oko, Katura Tops, and Sarah David Heidemann for their valuable feedback, and many civil rights, employment rights, and tech policy organizations that have endorsed the civil rights standards. You can read the standards at the link that has been dropped in the chat. I'll also drop my email address into the chat, and I'll invite the speakers to do so as well. We hope the civil rights standards will help shape industry and policymakers' thinking and inform advocates' efforts on building fairness and equity into employment decision-making practices. We look forward to continuing this conversation with you, and we encourage you to reach out to us to talk further about your perspectives on automated decision-making and how we can use or build on the standards to address algorithmic bias. Thank you so very much, and have a great rest of your day.